Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today in this 1-hour free webinar on Testers Can Prevent Defects 2, Maturing the Test Profession Towards True Quality Assurance. My name is Magdi Hanna, and I will be your speaker for this webinar. I'm also the CEO and founder of the International Institute for Software Testing. This webinar, like many other webinars in the same series, is sponsored by the International Institute for Software Testing, the leader in professional educational-based certifications. You can visit us at www.testinginstitute.com. Well, my goal in this webinar is for us to talk together about how we can improve and transform our test process to make it a true defect prevention process. We're going to understand the difference between quality assurance and defect prevention, and how we can really, as test professionals, as people who are leading test organizations, transform our process to not only find the defects, but also to be able to prevent them from the beginning. Let's first talk about why we need to, why do we need defect prevention? I don't know if I need to tell you that or argue that. I mean, of course, you can read books, you can look on the internet, you can find out people telling you that it costs much less when we discover the defect early in the life cycle. It would not cost anything, of course, if we were to prevent it. So the argument here is that if we believe that it costs much less to discover defects early, imagine how much would it cost really if we were to prevent defects in the first place. So the cost of fixing defects, we all know, is very high in all types of systems. Okay, now what if we can avoid this cost? Well, let me actually look at defect prevention from a different angle. I use this very simple chart when I speak to management and executives in companies to let them know that it is very critical to focus on defect prevention. What you see in front of you is normally development will write some code, will do some design, will send what they're writing to the test organization, the testing team to test it. And that's true whether your project is agile or not agile. It doesn't matter. This is a simple process, happens every day. Developers write code, they do design, they send what they write to testers to test it, okay? And typically what happens is, as you probably know very well, testers will find some problems. They will write bug reports in one way or another. Again, whether it is a traditional kind of bug report we write in non-agile projects or a much more simplified bug report. But the bottom line is we have bug reports that we write as testers, and we send them to developers. And of course, as usual, developers will take those and fix the bugs, and will give us another build or another, whatever you want to call it in your process, and that has the fixes in it. But in addition to the fixes, you know very well, everyone knows what happens here. What else beside the fixes we get? If you cannot replace those question marks by a phrase or a term or whatever you want to do, then you really have not been involved in the test and the develop test cycle. Typically what we get here is new problems, new bug fixes, new bug reports, okay? Now, of course, developers will not admit that. Most of the developers will not admit that. I've seen developers who would say, no, when I fix something, I don't break anything else. Well, that's never true. I can tell you that. Again, you can read out in the literature, different people have different opinion about how much how many new bugs we get with the fixes. Some people say the ratio is 1 to 4. Some people say the ratio is 1 to 3. I mean, I go with the very conservative ratio. I say let's talk 1 to 1, and I'm able actually in many places, in many occasions, I was able to, especially when I teach my course on unit and integration testing to developers. I ask the developers. I say, any one of you here can tell me that when you receive a bug report, you work on it, you fix it, and when you fix it, you do not break the software in any other place. And I have not seen one single developer anywhere, agile or not, who is willing to say that, who is willing to say they are able to fix bug reports without breaking the software anywhere else. No one can say that. So if we say average of 1 to 1, imagine what that means. That's very bad, by the way. And I ask developers, I say, would you agree that it is at least 1 to 1? Which means you work on a bug report, you fix it. Not every time you work on a bug report, you create a problem somewhere else. No, we're talking about average here. And we're talking about average even among all developers. So you might have a great developer who always fix problems and never break the software anywhere else. Okay, I'm willing to agree. But not all developers are like that. So again, average over all developers, over all the bug fixes, I think it's reasonable to agree on 1 to 1. Just to go back to your team and present this and see what reaction you can get. Present to developers, present it to testers. Okay, so what if it is 1 to 1? Well, that means that if a test team works for a week, and during that week they discover any number of bug reports, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's say in a week, 5 testers working, testing the build, they come up with what? 20 bug reports. They send those back to the developers. Developers work on it again in the average. They send the fixes, and they have another 20 problems. The problem with those new 20 problems is that they're not known. They are not known. They're not known to the tester. They're not known to the developer. I mean, it would have been nice if development will say, here are the fixes and here are some new problems we created. I don't think that could ever happen, simply because developers do not know where they broke the software. And of course, it's different every time. It varies. It varies based on what? Whether the bug fix involves some changes to the database or not. If it is a simple fix to the code, then maybe the developer will fix that without breaking anything else. If the fix involves some changes to the database, it is possible that they break the software in 3 or 4 other places. So that's why we say it's always average. Okay, so what happens to the new report, to the new problems here? Well, if testers have a good regression tester process, or if they are doing an agile project and continuous integration, of course, please don't let continuous integration fool you. Don't let continuous integration in the agile project fool you. Continuous integration will not catch those errors. I can tell you this much. They will not. So some of those can be found during the testing process, during regression testing, during continuous integration, whatever. And some of them were actually escaped to the customer, and that's a problem. That's a major problem. Why? Because now suddenly things that worked last week or things that worked in the previous release are no longer working. And let me tell you, based on my experience, nothing irritates your customer more than finding out that things that worked before are no longer working. Over time, when this happens a lot, businesses, customers, whether they are internal or external, they start losing trust in the process. I've been there on both sides. I've been there as delivery manager, delivering software. I've been there also as a customer in other situations. And as a customer, in some situations, I did lose trust in the company that was providing the software. And they said, listen, guys, we're not going to do any upgrade. We're not going to do upgrade. And we're going to stay on this version until we find another vendor to give us the software we need, to give us more stable software. Nothing irritates your customer from more than things, functionality that worked previously and no longer working. So that's the real problem. It's not only the cost of fixing the bugs. I mean, the cost here is there, right? The cost of finding some of those and writing the bug report and sending them back to development is also there. But what also is there is that those issues that will escape the process and go to your customer. So that's my simple explanation of why defect prevention is very critical. It's very critical. It's not only about money, trust me. It's all about customers and customer retention and being able to allow the customer to trust us in delivering what they need. So it is very critical to know that when we find defects early, it doesn't matter how early, that means that we did not prevent them. Okay, I say this for a reason. There are so many books out there. There are so many presentations and the blogs out there that when they speak about defect prevention, they start talking about code reviews and design reviews. Okay, and they say code reviews and design reviews are good defect prevention techniques. I hope none of you think that, okay? Because in code reviews and design reviews, if you find defects, then you did not prevent them. The defects are there in the product, in the code, in the design. And it is developers who put those in without knowing, of course. Okay? So simply stated, if you found a defect anytime, doesn't matter how early it is, then you did not prevent it because it's there. Phil Crosby says the error that's not made cannot be missed. So defect prevention to me means that we prevent defects from the beginning. Now, it sounds hard, right? How do we do that? Of course, you can imagine. I've been in software engineering for what, over 40 years now. I have not seen one single approach that can truly help you prevent defects. If anyone knows of one, please let me know. Again, if we go with that definition of defect prevention, which is simply preventing defect from the beginning. So which means a defect was never there. So we don't need to find it early or whatever, or otherwise, okay? So with that being said, I'm gonna just present to you a few things to help you in your process prevent defects. Before we do that, I'd like to take a look at the difference between quality assurance and quality control. And I'm doing this based on the teachings from the fathers of software quality, whether it is Phil Crosby, Dr. Edward Deming, and those people. Okay, there is a big difference between the two. So many of us already have the term quality assurance or QA in their title and the name of their departments. But let's find out if we actually practice quality assurance or not. This is my simple comparison. I'm sure some of you already know that. If you don't, well, that's great. Then this is the first time. Now, remember, quality control is more of a manufacturing term. many years ago, I think more explicitly in the spring of 1981, I was privileged to attend a presentation by Dr. Edward Deming, and I believe that was the last presentation he made. And since then, that presentation, what he said in that presentation, really resonated in me, and I started to think about how do we actually improve our processes to make them more of defect prevention. So this slide really based on my understanding of what Dr. Deming said. When we have a product in our hand, whatever the product is, the product could be a computer, an electronic circuit, it could be a piece of software that's functional, it doesn't matter what the product is. When we go after the product has been developed and try to run whatever tests, whatever inspections we do to discover problems. So we're really focusing on discovering problems in a product. That's quality control. We're focusing on the product, and the goal is to find problems in that product. That's quality control. With that being said, everything we do in testing to find problems in a software product is actually quality control. It's not quality assurance. It doesn't matter, even in inspections and reviews, code reviews, design reviews, even requirement reviews. What do we do in requirement reviews? We try to judge a piece of requirement if it is good or bad. Based on what? Based on certain standards, certain specs, certain understanding of what is a testable requirement. And we discover some problems with requirements. Well, guess what? As I said, if we discover problems in requirements, then we are not preventing those problems yet. So even requirement reviews, and again, one more time, this is my opinion. This is my experience. You might have a different opinion, and that's why you have this questions tab there. You can click on it. You can raise an issue. You can ask questions, and we can talk. All right. But even requirement reviews are quality control. They're not quality assurance. They're not preventive. They are simply ways to discover problems with requirements. Now, so what is quality assurance then? Quality assurance is when you focus on the process of creating the product you were trying to test or inspect. So if I were to go and focus on the requirement process and find out how requirements are written and talk about the skills of people who write requirements and improve that process, now we are preventing defects in the requirements. Okay? Don't be surprised. There are many ways to do that. Just people don't pay attention to them. When I go and look at the process of the development process itself, doing the design, doing the prototypes, writing the code, and so on, and we try to improve this process, we will eventually get code in the design that does not have defects. But the trick here is to know how to improve it. Okay, so quality assurance is mainly about improving a process, improving a process to prevent the problems in the process that will lead to problems in the products. Again, this discussion is a very basic discussion. If you've been in testing and the QA for a while, then you should know that. So again, QA is about focusing on a process and improve it. I take a much lighter, much laid back, much down to earth definition to QA. And I say, QA is about improving the way you do things. Every day, you can improve the way you do things. And if you cannot, if you're not improving the way you do your job, the way you're designing your tests, the way you're executing your tests, if you cannot improve this on a day-to-day basis, then really you are not doing anything useful, to be honest with you. You are not preventing defects. You're using a process as is, bad or good, good or bad, and that process could be producing bad results. So bad process will produce bad results. Good process will always produce good results. All right. So let me go a little bit more specific here. In my opinion, every tester professional must become a true quality assurance professional at heart, which means that in the way you do your job, you have to find ways to improve the way you do it on a daily basis. We need to go back to how we are doing our job. We need to go back and look at how we do certain things and find out, is this way of doing things helping us prevent defects or not? And again, I will show you a few things based on my experience. Remember, this is only 1 hour presentation, so I can only cover so much, but there's so much I've been doing, there's so much I have in my courses that I teach, but I took some pieces and put them in this free webinar, just to give you an idea, and you can go from there. So let's find out what it means for tester professionals to become true quality assurance professionals at heart. Let's first look at the sources of defects in software. Okay, because in order to improve the process, you have to look at the root cause of problems. Okay, and I have in front of me here 3 places that almost all of you can agree on. That's where we get defects. I put the first one because it's not the most commonly talked about one. Right. I refer to it as the gap between what's in the code and what testers are testing. That gap is always there. It just varies from one project to another. We all have to agree that the code, there is code there that implements functionalities, code that's written by developers that implements functionality that testers are not aware of. Now, I know many people are not willing to admit that. If you're willing to believe my 40 years of experience working with different types of projects, different sizes of projects, this is in every project. Okay, developers write code to do certain things that testers are not aware of. The only way, by the way, the only way that testers can be well aware of every line of code that's written is to have the tester sit next to the developer as they're writing the code, but that's impossible. Okay. It is true that some of the agile practices have improved that, and I'm willing to believe that in some agile projects, not all of them, in some agile projects, this gap has been minimized because of a lot of things, not because of the daily stand-up meetings. That does not really do much, but because of other things in the agile process, such as test-driven development and so on, if your team practices test-driven development. But let me explain to you why is that. Okay, because when developers take a requirement or a user story, they work on it. Okay, their interpretation of the requirement and the user story is different. Even if we had requirement reviews and we had user story reviews, we sat down, we met, we talked. Okay, there will be some details that developers will write the code for. The developers is not going to go back to the test team and says, oh, by the way, I'm doing this. Okay, that's the way it is. Of course, if we're using requirements as opposed to user stories, the problem is much bigger. Because here's what typically happens when when a developer works with an incomplete, ambiguous, inconsistent, poorly written requirement or a user story. They go and sit down and they try to do the design and do the code. They start having questions. As I always say, good developers will always go and ask those questions of someone. They can ask the product owner, they can ask the customer, they can ask the business analyst. So, and if they ask the question, they get an answer and they implement the code and the design according to this answer. Now, whether they ask the question or not, some developers do not ask the questions. Some developers just make assumptions about the answer. So whatever the question is. So they say, okay, I think I know what that is. And they make assumptions. And that's why I always say, making assumptions are okay, as long as you make sure you validate those assumptions. And every assumption you make will remain invalid until you validate it. If you do not validate an assumption, then you can assume that it is invalid. All right. Those developers who go and ask the questions, what do they do with the answers? I doubt that any developer out there walks to the tester and say, by the way, I had this question, I asked it to the product owner or to whoever, and I got an answer here, and this answer will change the way I do things. I don't think that ever happens anywhere. Not in Agile projects, not in non-Agile projects. Okay, so now my experience over the years was larger projects have always told me that there is a large gap, and that gap causes code coverage to be very low. That's why code coverage is very low, which means if testers test based on the user stories and acceptance criteria and the requirements or whatever, they will not be able to test everything in the code. So the gap is there. Now, another major source of defects. When a customer finds defects, have we ever asked ourselves, why did the customer find this defect, this problem, and our test team did not find it? Have you ever asked that question? I suggested that you try to ask the question. If you get a bug report from a customer, I suggest that the team tries to do some root cause analysis. And not only that, but also do some sort of analysis to find out, why did we miss that? Why did we not find that problem during our testing? Why did the problem escape our test process? You'll find out that what happened actually in production is something we never thought of. Something we never thought of. I don't understand why people do not pay attention to that. Why development teams and test teams do not pay attention to that, to those bug reports that are coming from the customer. And if we were to analyze them, I said 90% of those bug reports, 90% of bug reports come from the customer, from the field, are about scenarios, things that happened in the field, situations that we did not think about. And that's why we did not test them, right? Because it doesn't make sense that we tested them, but still they failed in production. About a small percentage, of bug reports that come from the field have already been tested and have passed the test, but then something in the operational environment caused the problem to happen. Although, of course, when we test, we're supposed to test also for every aspect of the possible operational environment. But again, I will leave some room for that. But again, the other 90% are mostly about things we did not think about. So I think we have something to work on here, right? I mean, if we know, just with the first two I told you here. I mean, if we know that customers are finding defects because there are scenarios that happen in production, that we did not think about them when we did our testing and when we did our development. The truth is, when we get a bug report from the field, from the customer, of course, developers look at it. And most likely, I mean, of course, in some cases, they find out the code was written in a certain way to do it in a certain way, but it did not handle the situation that the customer encountered in production. And sometimes they find that the code was not written to start with. There is no actually block of code that was written to handle that situation. So the bottom line is our code and our design did not handle a given situation. I'm focusing on that now. And that's why in my development process and my test process, which I refer to it as scenario-based development and testing, I focus so much on those things. Our development effort, our test effort has to be focused on what? On every possible scenario that can be encountered in production. If we're not writing the code and doing the testing based on those, I don't know how we hope to prevent defects. Customers will always find problems. So now it becomes obvious that a good, reasonable way to prevent defects is to focus on our development and test process and see how we can improve our scenario process or our requirement process or our user story process to make sure that we are going to cover everything that could possibly happen in production. I'll get into more details. Another source of defects that we all know about is bad fixes. Bad fixes. I refer to it as regression defects. And I put the chart again one more time. It's those question marks here. And those problems are there. And as I said earlier, we might discover some of those during regression testing or continuous integration or whatever, but many of them go out to the customer. Let's just focus on those three types of or sources of defects. There are other sources of defects, but again, when you do process improvement for the purpose of defect prevention, you need to kind of limit your scope to a smaller subset of sources of defects. And so let's focus on those. So I'm going to focus on the first one, which is the gap between development and testing. And how do we close that gap? How to minimize it, possibly eliminate it completely. Over time, you can, absolutely. But the more you work on closing that gap between what testers are testing and what developers are writing, the less defects you're going to have in the released software. So how do we work on eliminating that gap? I already talked about why the gap is there. I already said that many details about the requirements, okay, evolve during the development process, and that's okay. I'm not against that at all. This is the way we build the software. Requirements or even user stories are never finalized upfront. We continue to work with it during the development process. What I'm worried about is that how much involvement does the testing team have in that? Of course, people doing agile projects, they say, oh, we do a daily stand-up meeting. Again, don't let those fool you. Daily stand-up meetings are not going to help close the gap between the code and the design that's written by developers and the test cases that are written by testers. We don't speak about the code we're writing and the design we're doing and the test cases we're writing. We don't speak about those in stand-up meetings, okay? In a little bit, I'm going to suggest another kind of meeting. If you can afford to do it, that would be great. Most of the details come during the development process. Again, this is true, whether you're doing user stories or requirements. Doesn't matter, agile or non-agile. Okay. So a lot of requirement adjustments happen during the development process. And I am okay with that, as I said. I caution people a lot about backdoor discussions or side discussions between developers and someone else, like product owner, business analyst, management, whatever. This happens a lot in agile and non-agile projects. A developer has a question about something she or he is doing. What do? They walk to someone that they know can answer their question, and they get an answer, and they take the answer back to their cubicle and sit down and write the code or write the design accordingly, as I said. We need to make sure that those side discussions are eliminated. Now, someone says, are you saying that developers should not be talking to the product owner? Not on one-on-one, not one-on-one. That hurts the project. Developers we need to create a way to collaborate, of course. All agile projects have a lot of collaboration in them. But what you have to know to do now is what? Go back to your collaboration in an agile project or a non-agile project. Collaboration is always important, whether your project is agile or not. Find out how much collaboration do we really have. And again, don't think that the daily stand-up meetings is a way of collaboration. This is nothing. We have 10 minutes. What are we going to say in 10 minutes? We're going to simply say what we worked on yesterday, what we're going to be working on today. That's not collaboration as much as it is coordination. We're trying to coordinate our work. Sometimes we talk about problems that happened yesterday and how are we going to solve them today. But that's not to close the gap between what developers are doing and what testers are doing. Okay, so as a result of all that, really testers are not able to test more than 50 to 60% of the code. You don't believe me? Go and find a tool for code coverage if you're willing to invest on that, and use the tool to tell you how much of the code has not been tested. This is the bottom line. This is the bottom line. Any block of code that has not been tested, we don't know how it's going to act in production. It's very dangerous to have code that has not been tested. Very dangerous. It doesn't matter what the code does, as long as it is going to be executed in some scenarios in production. If it gets executed, we do not know how it works. Any block of code written by developers that has not been tested is very dangerous. I have some ways for you here to close the gap between what developers are writing and what testers are testing. Collaborative requirement and user story reviews. Of course, I'm sure you do that. But the way you do those, if I'm not suggesting that we sit down in a meeting, because guess what? You can imagine over my 40 years of experience how many of those meetings I've attended and how many of those meetings I ran and how often I found them failing completely. Why? Because people come to a meeting today, they talk, they discuss, they ask a question, and so on. What's going to happen a week from now, 2 weeks from now, when someone is working on that user story or the requirement? The same thing is going to happen again. Someone is having a question. We're not going to go back and have another meeting. Okay? That person who has a question is going to ask the question to someone. What I'm suggesting here is that we have an ongoing online collaborative review. And I have another webinar that covers that. So we have to use a collaborative review software where we put the user stories there, where we put the requirements there for working with requirements. And the review process is not limited by 1 day or 1 week. It's as long as we are working on that user story or the requirement. people can go anytime and ask questions and raise issues. And the other people can respond and react to those questions. And that's how the user story or the requirement becomes sort of a living artifact that changes. Not necessarily we're going to go back and change the requirement or the user story, but the details about them. Okay, the details about them are going to change. So when someone has a question, he or she cannot just walk to the product owner or the business analyst to ask that question. They have to put that question in the collaborative, on the online collaborative tool. And that question should be seen by everybody, not only the product owner or the business analyst who possibly can answer the question. No, everyone else who can possibly be impacted by the question and by the answer to that question. All right, so again, it's an ongoing open form of discussion, okay, where people put questions, raise issues. When someone picks up that question and answers the question, the answer will be seen by everybody. As a tester, if I see the answer to a question affects the way I should be writing my test cases, then I should go and add more test cases or change my test cases or whatever. That's simply improving the requirement/user story review process. Online, ongoing, collaborative. Use whatever tool you like. Use Jira. Use anything. I'm using Romana ALM, which is an ALM tool, but it has a collaborative review component to it. And it's linked to the user stories and linked to the requirements. Okay, and actually this is the tool I use with my development team and my test team all the time. And it works great. It works great. I mean, as long as we're still working on the user story or the requirement, anyone can go and ask a question. And even after the developer has finished the code and the design, a tester will have a question, and the developer will go back and change the code and the design based on the answer to the question. All right. Another way to do this is, what I just mentioned, is scenario-based development and testing, and I will speak about this in details. Scenarios are everything that could possibly happen in production. And when we do scenario-based development testing, it has, as part of it, is collaborative scenario validation. Collaborative scenario validation, which means whoever is writing the scenarios is going to put them again on the online tool and an ongoing reviews of those scenarios. Now, of course, some people say, but we use user stories and user stories have possibly acceptance criteria. Okay, fine. If you're kind of confused about scenarios or acceptance criteria, I have another webinar that has been recorded and posted about acceptance criteria versus scenarios. And you can see the difference and you can decide for yourself and your team which one you want to use. Okay, but whether it is acceptance criteria or scenarios, there has to be an ongoing online collaborative scenario acceptance criteria validation, because we do not, again, we cannot sit down for an hour to review those and we're done. No, it will not happen. No one can come up with all the acceptance criteria or all the scenarios at once. No one can think about everything. We have to, I mean, especially when it comes to scenarios, as I'm going to explain it, you have to have this effort going all the time. See, a tester, while she or he is testing, they can come up with an idea of a scenario that was never mentioned anywhere before. Now, she does this while the code and the design has already been written, and we're testing. And now the tester is coming up with a scenario. What does she do? She posts that scenario in the online collaborative review tool and find out if this scenario is supposed to be within the scope or not. The product owner or the business analyst or the project manager, whoever, can say, yes, that is within the scope and we need to support that scenario. Well, guess what? The developer did not write any code to handle that scenario. What do we do here? Of course, it's always iterative process. And it doesn't have to be an agile project to be an iterative process. My gosh, we've talked about iterative process years ago, before even agile existed. So okay, developers need to check out the code from the code version control tool and write additional code to handle that scenario, and to check in the code again, and the testing will continue. I mean, in agile, that's not a big deal, right? In agile, it happens all the time. But even if your project is not agile, you can still do that. Collaborative scenario validation all the time. Some of the scenarios we came up with them early in the process. We might discover during testing that those scenarios are not part of the scope of this, and we remove them. All right, if we are going to do code and design review meetings, we have to clearly understand the purpose of the meeting. Why are we doing them? Now, I'm not suggesting, because in the beginning I said code and design reviews are not defect prevention. So I'm not putting those here as a way to prevent defects. I am putting those here as a way to close a gap. Remember, I'm focusing on closing the gap. And code and design reviews are a good place to close the gap. How does this happen? The focus of the code and design review meeting has to be on two things. One, on closing the gap. Two, on impact analysis, which is coming in the last bullet here. Of course, the development team can have their own agenda about the code and design review meetings, but our own agenda from a testing perspective, our own agenda is I go to the code review meeting and design review meeting to do two things. One, to understand what's in the code and what's in the design that I am not aware of. Because remember, the gap is all about that. It's about things in the code and then things in the design that testers are not aware of. Well, what would be a better place to discover that gap and try to close it? So a tester will be sitting in that meeting and listening carefully and trying to understand. Of course, a lot of the stuff that developers are saying would easily go over your head and you don't understand it. Fine. But your goal is this. If there is a discussion about something that you don't believe you have scenarios and test cases to cover, then that's when you speak up. That's when you say, hey, Joe, I'm not clear exactly where this discussion is going. I am looking here at the scenarios that I came up with for this functionality. I don't have anything about this. Was that something that we learned about it later? Was something that you guys discussed with whoever, the product owner or the business analyst or whoever? I mean, you're trying to understand why is it that there is something there that they're talking about in a code review or design review meeting that you're not accounting for, that you're not testing. And of course, you may not be able to get all the details during the meeting, but you might have to have a side discussion after the meeting with that specific developer to say, okay, let me understand what is it that you're doing here, because I want to make sure that I test everything you're doing. And trust me, every developer would be very interested that you test everything they're doing, because no developer would like their code to be taken directly to the field, to the customer, because if it fails, it'd be a problem. So they would like to educate you about it, and they want you to be testing it. So that's my reason to put code and design review meetings there. Not because they are ways to prevent defects. They are ways to close the gap. Another reason I'm suggesting code and design review here is because we use them for the impact analysis. Let me talk about the impact analysis, which is the last bullet here. Impact analysis is simply saying developers need to understand the impact of the changes they make to the code and to the design. If they don't understand the impact of the changes, then they cannot avoid those bad fixes. They're going to be doing bad fixes all the time, and we get those additional problems that we get them all the time. Okay, so as a result, a code and design review meeting is a good place to discuss impacts of changes made by developers to the code and to the design. And as a tester, I'm sitting there in a code or design review meeting. I'm trying to understand if the change that's being presented affects the way I'm supposed to be doing testing in any way. And if it does, then I go back and add more scenarios, add more test cases to my test suite, and test more. So code and design review meetings should be happening, and test teams should be fully participating in that. It's not just something for developers. Okay. Now, the bullet I just skipped is a daily or weekly update meetings. Those meetings, I'm suggesting them for either agile or non-agile projects. Simply saying, let's try to get together to get an update. Update on what? Simply, the purpose of this is mostly to close the gap. It's simply saying, what did I do today as a developer that can affect the way you should be doing your job as a tester? Okay. What scenarios did I discover while I was writing my code? What ideas did I come up with? What questions do I have? Of course, if we have this ongoing online collaborative review tool, you may not need the daily or weekly update meetings because the tool does this job very well. Okay. And if you'd like, I'm sure Jira has a way to do this. I'm not a Jira user because I've been using Romana for years, and you know, I can explain to you how it works. But I'm sure you can find a way in Jira to do that. But the point is, if you have a tool, that's good. If you don't have a tool, then the daily or weekly update meetings. I don't know if weekly is a good idea, but if you cannot afford it to do it daily, then you have to do what you have to do. But the purpose of those meetings are simply update about the differences between what developers are doing that testers need to know about. Okay. Again, it's to close the gap. To close the gap. Let's go on here because I have only about 7 minutes left. I'm going to give you a glimpse at the scenario-based development and testing process. I mean, of course, this process, I explain it on most of my courses. Any course that I teach for the International Institute for Software Testing, I try to teach pieces of that process. But this is really the high-level diagram of this process. At the top here, you might be starting with user stories or requirements, or you might have use cases of your project using use cases. You have models. You might have even user interface, which this diagram is missing. But the bottom line is this: whatever you're starting with, we have a collaborative analysis and review and questions, and everything is documented, and that's when the online collaborative review tool would come in place. Okay. Now, and this is an ongoing. It's a bidirectional, as you can see. I mean, you're looking at a user story or you're looking at a requirement. By the way, user interface is part of models because prototypes and user interface diagrams and wireframes and things like that are a form of a model. But there are other kind of models too that I discuss in details in my courses. But okay, you got this collaborative review and analysis, you get questions and answers all documented, and ideally if you're using the tool, everything is documented in the tool. Okay, then you come to the collaborative scenario development, and that's when we build the scenarios collaboratively. Of course, someone is going to take charge. Maybe one of the testers are going to build the scenarios for the specific user story, but everyone should be participating in that. Again, we're not sitting in a meeting here. We are using a collaborative tool to do this, and it's an ongoing. It's not something we're going to do it over an hour or 2 hours. Absolutely not. Building scenarios, thinking about scenarios, the brainstorming a process. And funny enough, people think that they can sit down in a meeting for an hour to do some brainstorming. I have not seen this to work very well. I can see the brainstorming happening over a period of time. So that's why the use of collaborative tool is very important. Then we collaboratively review and validate those scenarios. And again, those are ongoing. Everything here is at the same time. Okay, it's not in sequence here. This is not a sequential process. Once we validate and finalize our scenarios, then guess what? Only then developers can take those scenarios, work on them, write the code, write the design. Testers can take the same scenarios to write their test design, test cases, whatever test scripts. And by that, I am guaranteeing a much higher level of code coverage. Why? Because now, if developers are writing the code and the design based on scenarios, and testers are taking the same scenarios, building their tested design, then the tested design is mapping directly to the code. There shouldn't be any line of code or any block of code here that developers are writing that's not being tested. Where would it come from? It shouldn't. We shouldn't have any, because developers are writing everything based on scenarios. They're not writing everything based on user stories or requirements or even acceptance criteria. They're writing it based on scenarios, which are very concrete and explicit. If you see my examples of scenarios, you'd see why I'm saying this works. Okay, but again, this is not the place to cover the process in details. All right. So another thing beside the higher level of code coverage, I mean, this process is guaranteeing that there is no code out there that's not being tested. It is also guaranteeing that we prevented problems to start with. We closed the gap. There's no gap there. Okay, and from the beginning, we came up with all the scenarios and we validated all scenarios. So when we come down here to test, as many companies told me, that is reducing the number of defects by much. I mean, some companies told me up to 70% reduction in the number of open tickets, as they said it. Okay, and I'm not trying to sell you anything here. I'm just telling you that this works. All right. I'm giving you this picture to describe how the synchronous collaborative review is. You're using the tool here, and there is a shared repository, and everyone is interacting with the tool, putting some questions, putting some scenarios, putting answers to the questions, and so on. Everything is in that tool. So this is a general picture of a synchronous collaborative review. It's not happening at the same time. It's happening over the period of the project or the sprint or whatever it is. Okay. I spoke briefly about impact analysis. I have a minute here to cover it as well. Impact analysis, as I said, is really the responsibility of developers. Developers need to understand the impact of the changes they made to the design, the code, and they must share this information, whatever you call it, impact analysis report or notes. They have to share it during the code review meetings and during the daily, weekly update meetings. I already talked about those, so this is kind of summing it up all together. Impact analysis is very important, and then when testers do regression testing, they have to do it based on the impact analysis information they received. All right, this is my last slide, and we're just about to close on time. Always strive to prevent defects. You may not be able to prevent them 100% right away, but you should be able to minimize. Your goal is to keep reducing the number of defects that are found by the testing team, that are found by production. Rework will always cost more than doing it right the first time. So we're trying to get it done right the first time. Okay, and we talked about the bad fixes. Anytime development team are going to fix a problem, most likely they're going to create other problems. And keep in mind, any defect you find, you did not prevent it. So finding defects is not the same as, or finding defects early is not the same as preventing it. Thank you very much for being with me in this webinar. I'm going to peek very quick here to see if there's any questions I need to answer. Someone saying SharePoint would work too, right? Is there a way to notify all of, okay. I'm not gonna comment on a specific tool because I already mentioned our tool, the Romana ALM, and SharePoint would not be my favorite tool anyway, because you have to share one thing at a time. You have to share one requirement or one user story at a time. Okay, you have to have all the scenarios and all the test cases and all the questions that being asked and all the answers attached to that user story or the requirement. So SharePoint does not allow you to do this. This webinar is being recorded now, and it will be made available on the IIST website, testinginstitute.com, sometime next week. And hopefully we'll see you in other webinars. Thank you very much for joining me today.